The traditional career is completely dead. Stick around and I'll tell you why. Hey everybody, it's Brian from Life After Layoff, and today I want to talk about the traditional career and why it's collapsing and is probably completely dead at this point. It's been drilled into most of us that we need to select a career at age 18, put our 40 years in being a dedicated company person, collect our pension, and then move off into the sunset. And of course, that loyalty goes above all else, and we expect the same thing from the employer. However, for most of us in the modern workplace, we're finding that that just doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, I would suggest that the traditional career is completely dead. And in this video, I'm going to break down why I feel this has happened and what we can do about it going forward. But before we get into that, if you're interested in learning how to reclaim control in your career and start to act with more authority and conviction instead of being very reactive, check out my free newsletter. And in it, I share concise, actionable tips on how to approach your job search and your career with more authority and conviction. And if you're somebody that's in an active job search or you care about your career in the long term, this is definitely the newsletter for you. Keep in mind, it's absolutely free, so hope to see you over there. Okay, so many of us remember our grandparents or our parents working long traditional careers. At age 18, they enter into the workforce and they land their first job without much effort, whether it's through nepotism or simply filling out a basic resume and hand delivering it to the receptionist at the front desk. And in those days, it might have been called the personnel department. But then they immediately get hired without much trouble, and then they proceed to work a very fulfilling 45-year career, getting a great pension plan. They have a going away party. Everybody wishes them well. They ride off into the sunset in their Winnebago and head down to Florida to buy prime Florida real estate at a fraction of what we pay for it today. And under their breath, they grumble about how the younger generation just doesn't want to work. And in their day, loyalty, hard work, and perseverance were valued above all else, and that it's just lacking in today's generations. And back then, employers did treat their employees with a degree of loyalty and vice versa, and there was an expectation that that would be the case. They didn't just lay off people constantly, and you could be not great at a particular job, but they would move you into a different department and all would be well. But in today's day of instant gratification, where everything needs to be at your fingertips, and if you don't have results immediately, you're only worried about the next news cycle or the next earnings report. And even though you might have hit a grand slam for them the year before, you could be on the chopping block the next year. It's a what have you done for me lately type of environment. And I do believe this is related to a world where we are overly connected with instant data at our fingertips and things moving even faster. And even job boards. If you look at how hiring happened back then, hiring was a very localized thing. There was a company based in a certain geographic region, and the people who lived in that geographic region would often work for the one or two major employers in that area. And so that's why you saw a lot of nepotism. You knew somebody who worked at that factory and you got your foot in the door, or your father worked there and brought you in with them. But nowadays, we're so connected in such a global economy and the rise of job boards and LinkedIn and all of these other tools. And in some cases, people are applying for thousands of jobs all across the globe from the comfort of their own home. And that's a drastic difference from what it was like back in the day. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get a job in today's market. You're competing with thousands of other people across the globe, so the competition is much more fierce. Furthermore, companies have the short-term mentality of what have you done for me lately and this cycle of layoffs. And if you're not familiar with the cycle of layoffs, what I've observed is that layoffs tend to follow the same pattern as the economy. So you have a starting point and the economy will expand and companies bloat and bloat and bloat. And then there's usually some major event that causes companies to lay off a bunch of people, they right size, and then they get back to business. And I've observed that this cycle happens over about a 10-year period. However, it does seem like it's shortening and exponentially moving quicker. So that's not necessarily a great thing for the average employee. If we look back into the late 90s, we had the dot-com bubble. So you had all these companies like Amazon and eBay and Google all rising up and starting to take a prominent place in the market. So companies kind of built up their infrastructure. Everybody was hiring. It was a heyday. You could just throw money at the market and double and triple your investments. And of course, the dot-com bubble burst and those good times came to an end when we had a major event in the early 2000s, which was 9/11. So then after that, all these companies stopped hiring. There was a lot of panic in the market. Everybody started laying off. And then there was a right sizing that happened, or I should say a right sizing. So then the economy started to pick up again. Companies started gradually over the period of a few years hiring and hiring. The bloat started happening over and over again. And the next major event happened, which was the prime real estate bubble bursting in 2008. So the same thing happened. Everything reset. Companies went through mass layoffs, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. But over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, we had a pretty uninterrupted period of growth where companies just bloated and bloated and bloated. And I'm sitting here thinking like, gosh, this is not going to end well. I was waiting for this right sizing event that seemed to be pretty consistent every 7 to 8 to 10 years. So lo and behold, what happens in 2020? The entire economy shuts down due to the pandemic. And of course, ever since then, now we've seen these companies right-sizing and then right-sizing every couple of years, because now it seems like the entire employment market is being destroyed. And at this point, I'm not convinced we'll ever come back to a sense of normalcy, certainly not the traditional market that we used to know. And if you look back at your parents' and your grandparents' generations in the workplace, they weren't nearly as susceptible to these layoffs. I'm not saying that they never happened and that people didn't get furloughed, but it wasn't as common as it is today. And that's how people got to work 40 plus years relatively uninterrupted. And at the same time, there wasn't this massive pool of labor for these companies to recruit. So if they laid people off, they had to be much more careful and concise. Whereas nowadays, they can lay off anytime they want, and they've got a million candidates at their fingertips. And the next major decoupling in the workplace is back then there was a defined benefits plan. Employers would very commonly pay for an entirety of an employee's retirement plan. So it was through pensions and that sort of thing, these defined benefit programs. And at some point in time in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a switch from defined benefits to a defined contribution plan, where the employer then shifted all of the burden onto the employee and then only gave a small match as a result. And they tried to pitch it as some great benefit to the employee, but the reality is that employees now are on the hook for paying for all of their retirement. And that was a major shift in the employment arrangement. To make matters even worse, companies put in long vesting periods, 4+ years, to claim the money that they would match you. And so in some cases, it might only be 3 or 4% of your income that they would match. And you had to work a certain number of years, usually at least 4, before you would make claim to the employer's money. So in other words, if the employer matched a bunch of money for you and they laid you off after year 2, they weren't on the hook for the last 2 years of vesting, and they would take all that money back from you. So employers are even less committed to the employee as a result. And so when the older generations are venting about how the younger generations don't have loyalty, it really goes both sides. And in fact, I would say it's the employer side more than the employee. The employee is fairly reactive in the relationship. The employer is now laying people off at a moment's notice because now they have a broader pool of candidates than they ever had back in the 70s, 60s, 50s. And in addition to that, they're not paying for retirement programs like they used to. So there isn't a sense of loyalty. They've decoupled from the employee and made themselves much more free of that shackle. And on top of it, we have the rise of disruptive technologies like AI. Now, I've talked about AI in other videos, so I'm not going to necessarily go into a lot of depth here. And it's not to say that there wasn't disruptive technologies in the past, because there certainly have been over time. In our generations, and I would include the generations that have already retired recently, there has never been a more disruptive technology to enter into the workforce conversation than artificial intelligence. It stands to outplace millions of jobs, and it's another dynamic that the employers can detach loyalty. They don't even need the employee the same way that they used to. So when you look at the concept of loyalty being dead, it really is. And as a further extension of that, careers being dead. The traditional career no longer exists the way it did before. And let's face it, it's never going to get back to where it was. And so as a result, the way we approach work is changing drastically, and it's seeming to evolve quicker and quicker. So what's next for our generations who are still in the workplace? Well, I think you're going to see a lot more short-term assignments being much more commonplace. The idea of job hopping is probably going to be a little less taboo, because let's face it, people are getting laid off before they even show up for day one on a job. So how can you expect people to have solid resumes when you're laying them off constantly? And in fact, if a company lays you off and then later on the same hiring manager that just laid off a bunch of their staff starts to say that they're eliminating candidates because they have too much job hopping on their resume, it's a pretty hypocritical position to be in. And furthermore, I think we're going to see a continued rise in contract positions as employers try to avoid hiring these expensive full-time employees that they've got to pay benefits for. They've got to pay 401ks that, let's face it, they're probably not going to vest on anyway. But they're moving further and further away from the traditional employment model themselves. And furthermore, I think employees are going to have to reevaluate how they're approaching funding their retirement. You're not going to be able to rely on an employer funding even a 401k at this point anymore when they're laying off so frequently. And that can be particularly disruptive for people who are moving further into their careers and they're starting to see the twilight of their career or that retirement event coming up, and they might be realizing, oh crap, I might not be ready for this. Of course, at the same time, there's think tanks suggesting that the retirement age should be moved back to 70 or even beyond, which I'm starting to wonder, is this all a planned agenda? But this is all necessitating us to look at our careers much more strategically, much more as a free agent, and much more as the CEO of our career, because we won't be able to rely on an employer to look out for our best interest the way our grandparents or our parents may have. And again, if you're somebody that's looking to reclaim control in your career, check out my newsletter. It is designed to do that. And check out my website, alifeafterlayoff.com. Anyway, these are some thoughts that have been on my mind as I've been talking to more and more people about disruptions in their career. And it just is dawning on me that the traditional career certainly seems like it's dead. What's your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, appreciate you watching. We'll see you on the next one.